One game, that's all it took. 90 minutes into the biggest tournament in world football and an entire national project didn't just fail, it collapsed inward like a structure losing every support beam at once. Years of planning, scouting, rebuilding, tactical reinvention, and public promises of a new era didn't fade gradually. They disappeared in real time under stadium lights that suddenly felt too bright for what was unfolding on the pitch. What made it worse wasn't only the defeat, it was the realization that the collapse didn't begin there, it only became visible there, and that distinction changes everything in football, because when a system fails in public, it usually means it has been failing in private for a long time. Before the tournament, everything looked stable from the outside, qualification results were acceptable, possession statistics were balanced, defensive numbers looked structured enough to justify optimism, and press conferences were carefully controlled. Almost rehearsed, the Federation repeated one word constantly: progress. But progress is one of the most misleading words in football, because it can describe movement without describing direction, and inside the camp, direction was exactly what was missing. Training methodology had become increasingly rigid, built around automated patterns rather than adaptive decision-making, reducing creative players into functional roles instead of expressive ones. Analysts inside the staff began noticing a dangerous trend. The team could execute instructions, but struggled to interpret situations, and that gap is where elite football collapses. Senior players felt it first, not in public statements, but in micro-decisions on the pitch: the extra touch instead of the first-time pass, the safe return ball instead of vertical progression, the hesitation before committing to space that previously would have been attacked instinctively. And when hesitation enters a team, it spreads faster than any tactical instruction can contain it. Psychologically, the team shifted from proactive to reactive football without acknowledging the transition, and that is often the first stage of systemic decline. Still, externally, nothing appeared urgent, until the warm-up matches exposed structural fragility, not in results alone but in mechanics. The pressing system was inconsistent, triggered late and often disconnected between lines. The defensive block lacked vertical compression, creating exploitable spaces between midfield and defense, and the attacking phase became isolated, relying on individual effort rather than coordinated patterns. Professional analysts would describe this as a breakdown in rest defense structure, meaning the team was no longer organized during transitions, which is where modern international football is decided. Even more concerning was the emotional response inside matches. Players stopped correcting each other proactively, communication became fragmented, and leadership on the pitch became unclear. With no dominant voice stabilizing the system under pressure, the Federation, meanwhile, entered a phase common in high-stakes environments: cognitive dissonance, publicly defending stability while internally reviewing contingency scenarios. Once that duality appears, decision-making becomes only a matter of timing, not possibility. Then came the World Cup, the environment where weak structures are either stabilized or exposed completely. From the opening minutes of the first match, the issue was not intensity but synchronization. Distances between lines were incorrect, triggering broken pressing traps. Midfielders were arriving late to second balls, and defenders were constantly forced into emergency actions instead of controlled positioning. In elite football analysis, this is described as a failure of collective timing, and it is one of the hardest problems to fix mid-tournament because it is not tactical alone, it is cognitive. The opposition immediately recognized the instability, and at this level, teams do not need domination to win control, they only need to accelerate the opponent's confusion. One misplaced pass became structural doubt became positional hesitation, and hesitation became full defensive panic. By the time the first goal was conceded, the psychological state of the team had already shifted. The reaction was not anger or resilience, but fragmentation. Players began operating as individuals instead of a unit, which is always the true beginning of collapse. The second goal confirmed what the first exposed, but the deeper issue was not the scoreline, it was the absence of coordinated response mechanisms. There was no visible tactical adjustment on the pitch, no stabilizing leadership moment, no emotional reset. On the touchline, the manager attempted to reassert structure through instructions, but the team had entered a phase where information was no longer being processed effectively under stress, a phenomenon sports psychologists refer to as cognitive overload under pressure. By halftime, the match was no longer being analyzed as a contest but as a system failure event. Internally, Federation executives shifted focus from match outcome to leadership evaluation, because the same patterns had been flagged months earlier in internal technical reports, including concerns about adaptability under high pressing, lack of midfield progression solutions, and over-reliance on predefined build-up patterns that break under dynamic opposition structures. These were not new problems, they were previously contained problems that had now become visible on the biggest stage, and that visibility changed everything, because football institutions do not tolerate public systemic failure at World Cup level without consequences. The second half did not represent tactical evolution, it represented controlled continuation of a deteriorated structure. And when the final whistle arrived, there was no shock inside decision rooms, only confirmation of a trajectory already being discussed informally before the tournament began. Within hours, crisis meetings escalated into structural decisions, and the manager's dismissal was not framed as reaction but as correction, although in reality it was both. The speed of the decision reflected not only performance concerns but fear of tournament collapse continuing unchecked, which in elite competitions is treated as an emergency state. The reaction outside the federation was immediate and divided along predictable lines. Some interpreted it as decisive leadership, others as institutional panic disguised as control, but internally, the reasoning was simpler. The team no longer displayed functional coherence, and at World Cup level, that is considered an unacceptable risk regardless of timing. The appointment of a replacement manager followed a different logic entirely, prioritizing psychological stabilization over tactical identity. The chosen profile was experienced in crisis environments, known for simplifying systems under pressure, restoring basic structural discipline, and reducing cognitive load on players rather than expanding tactical complexity. The first intervention was not tactical sophistication but simplification architecture, reducing build-up variations, defining fixed transitional roles, and eliminating ambiguous decision zones on the pitch. In elite performance terms, this is called restabilization through constraint, where clarity replaces freedom temporarily to restore baseline functionality. However, even the most effective structural intervention cannot immediately repair trust, because trust in football is not rebuilt through instructions but through successful repetitions under pressure. The squad itself was now psychologically segmented, one group still attached to previous methods, another group relieved by change, and a third group simply disengaged due to uncertainty overload. And such fragmentation creates inconsistent decision-making patterns that are visible immediately in match tempo, pressing triggers, and transition responses. As the next match approached, preparation shifted toward controlled survival strategy rather than competitive dominance. Training intensity was reduced strategically to avoid cognitive overload, video sessions focused on opponent patterns rather than self-expression, and leadership roles were redistributed to create clearer on-field hierarchy. This is often what high-level crisis management looks like, not rebuilding identity, but preventing further collapse. Because at tournament level, time is not a development tool, it is a constraint. And when the next match finally arrived, the psychological framing had completely changed. It was no longer about achieving qualification dominance or tactical validation. It was about preventing systemic elimination from accelerating further. Every action on the pitch carried disproportionate weight, every mistake risked reopening instability, and every successful sequence had to function as emotional reinforcement as much as tactical execution. The stadium environment amplified this pressure, with crowd energy shifting from expectation to anxiety, a subtle but powerful change that players always feel even before analyzing the game itself. And as the teams walked out, the narrative had already evolved beyond football mechanics. It had become a test of institutional resilience under collapse conditions, a scenario where survival depends less on brilliance and more on coherence under stress, because at this stage, the question was no longer whether the team could play well, but whether it could remain structurally intact long enough for anything else to matter. And in World Cup football, that distinction is often the difference between recovery and complete disappearance from the tournament entirely. In professional football terms, This case is not simply about a tactical failure or a poor result in a decisive match, but about the breakdown of an entire performance ecosystem under maximum competitive pressure. When a national team reaches a World Cup, marginal differences in preparation, cohesion, and psychological stability become decisive variables, and in this scenario, the evidence suggests that structural instability predated the tournament itself. The key failure was not the absence of talent, but the absence of adaptive coherence, an inability for tactical principles, player roles, and emotional leadership to function as a unified system when exposed to real-time stress conditions. From a technical perspective, the most critical issue was the lack of transitional stability, particularly in defensive to offensive phases, where modern football is most frequently decided. Without synchronized spacing and coordinated pressing triggers, the team was repeatedly forced into reactive states, which naturally increase cognitive load and reduce execution quality over time. This type of systemic imbalance cannot be corrected solely through motivational change or managerial replacement during competition, as it requires structural repetition and long-term calibration. From a psychological and organizational standpoint, the rapid managerial change reflects a deeper institutional vulnerability, decision-making under panic conditions rather than strategic planning cycles. While leadership changes can provide short-term stabilization effects, they also introduce identity disruption, especially in environments where players have not yet internalized consistent tactical frameworks. This creates a temporary performance vacuum where instructions increase but clarity decreases. Ultimately, this situation illustrates a fundamental principle of elite football. Tournaments are not won by talent alone, but by the ability of a system to remain coherent under progressive stress accumulation. Once coherence is lost, even small errors escalate disproportionately, and recovery becomes increasingly dependent on external events rather than internal control. Therefore, the true lesson of this collapse is not about one match, one coach, or one decision, but about the timing gap between structural decline and institutional response. In high-performance football, success depends not only on building strong systems, but on recognizing early when those systems begin to fail, because by the time failure becomes visible on the world stage, the margin for correction is already critically reduced. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe for more football analysis and deep tactical storytelling. Your support helps grow the channel and bring more content like this. See you in the next video.